because I felt like we kind of stopped abruptly last week. We were talking about the beheading of John the Baptist and how Jesus' disciples, this is in the Gospel according to Mark, the way that Mark lays these stories out in succession, I think really talks about the urgency, or expresses the urgency that Mark continually has throughout his Gospel. Mark uses the word immediately more than any other writer in the Bible. And that's kind of his transition word from story to story is immediately this happened. Immediately this happened. Now, whether these things happen back to back chronologically, the way that Mark lays them out, that's kind of questionable. I don't think that's the point of Mark doing that. I think for Mark, Mark, by the way, is the shortest gospel. Mark also has the shortest pericopes or stories in his gospel. The other gospel writers kind of expand on the details. Mark is really abrupt to the point, and he uses that word immediately, I think, to express this sense of urgency and that Jesus was about getting things done. So he lays out the story of John the Baptist, and that happens in the Gospel according to Mark. While the disciples are out in their pairs of two, they're out ministering. John the Baptist is beheaded. They come back, and they all kind of talk about John the Baptist being beheaded, and I think that was a huge blow to them. If you think about the significance that John the Baptist had in all of their lives, not just in preparing the way for Jesus, but in all of their lives, he had tremendous significance. And we talked about politically, this would have been very scary for them because King Herod, who had the power to do the same thing to any of them, was the one who beheaded John the Baptist. Even though he liked him. He liked John the Baptist. So likability is not a factor when you get to politics. That's another life lesson. In case you haven't learned, the IRS, the politicians, they may talk nice to you face to face, but trust me, they do not want to be your friends. They could care less, generally speaking. But Herod had this power. And I think that would have had this heavy weight on the shoulders of the disciples. So Mark records that Jesus told them, let's go out to a desolate place. Let's go to a place where nobody's there. They go across the Sea of Galilee, which is a lake, about 6 miles across. They go to the other side, and Mark records that the crowd followed them by foot around the rim of the lake. Now, Jacob talked to me after class last week, and he said, what's interesting about that is we visited there, and he said, I think a lot of Americans read this as there's like this nice soft beach all the way around. He said, that's not the way the Sea of Galilee is. He said, it is straight up and straight down. He said, all the way across, the whole way around the lake. It's these massive mountains. It's in the middle of the mountains. And he said that would have been a very strenuous journey. I assume, based on Jacob's description of that probably a lot of people didn't make it. You would have had to be pretty physically fit. A lot of these parents were carrying small children. It's not like they were like, oh, well, let's conveniently walk across or jog across and we'll meet Jesus and his disciples there. And I think that shows the desperation of the people, the level of desperation to receive some kind of something, some kind of help, hope. Jesus recognized that level of desperation. And again, the way that Mark records it is that Jesus looked at the crowds and had compassion on them. And he began healing. Immediately, he began healing and teaching them about the kingdom of God. So today's word, the catchword for today is exhaustion. What did Jesus do with exhaustion and about exhaustion? Because I can tell you, by the time they landed on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee, according to Mark, Mark is pretty descriptive in this. he uses the phrase, they had no leisure even to eat because the crowds were so great around them. They're processing John's death. They've been healing people. They've been out on their own. They came back, kind of regrouped. They couldn't eat meals because the people were the needs were so great. And if you've ever done short-term mission work in a developing nation, you realize, Dave, I think, can appreciate this, right? It's not like we're propping our feet up and we're like, man, let's, pull out the hammocks and let's relax. The day of the medical clinic, that was a day of exhaustion and short tempers and, we felt the weight of people pressing in on us, people who are desperate. Dave was running triage, and I remember you getting really frustrated because there were parents who had, assumingly parents of little kids, women with children were kind of bumped to the front of the line. And so they would take babies and they would pass them. And Dave started noticing this trend, like, I think I've seen this baby before, a couple times. And it just kept happening over and over. And I could sense the frustration with Dave. And people were literally pressing in on us. And, we were kind of getting worried that there was going to be some unrest among the people because there's just this level of desperation. And they just kept coming. The people kept coming and coming. And there were hundreds of people. I think we had somewhere around, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had I think we counted somewhere around 250. Yeah. And these are people who are absolutely desperate. And they're literally pressing in. So this picture that Mark draws, it was like this constantly. And so they go to get rest from that. And here's this crowd, not of hundreds, but of thousands and thousands of people. Jesus has compassion on them. He begins healing them. And then he says to his disciples, his disciples said to him, well, Lord, it's getting late. In other words, time to move this along. This is going to be a never-ending cycle. There's no way we can meet the needs of all these people. Send them home so that they can get food. And Jesus says what? To his disciples, you get them something to eat. Well, then, that, I think, tempers flared a little bit, at least the way that I read Mark. They get a little bit sarcastic with Jesus, and they push back a little bit. And then, of course, we have the story of the miraculous feeding. They feed them all. The disciples hand out all this food. This had to have taken hours and hours for this to happen. It's now nighttime, and that's where we're going to pick up this week. It's nighttime, and instead of Jesus saying, hey, let's sneak away, and they were really in the middle of nowhere. They really were. And I think it would have been easy and fair for Jesus to say, let's sneak away. It's dark. Let's turn out the torches so people can't find us. Let's go find a quiet place somewhere. Let's go rest. You guys have really earned it. Right? I know after we got back from a medical clinic for 6-7 hours, the exhaustion that we wore, we could all feel each other's exhaustion. We weren't anywhere close to where the disciples were. It's fair and easier to say, guys, let's sneak away. I'm going to pull you away from the crowds. Jesus certainly could have done it. He just miraculously fed 5,000 people. I think he could have found a quiet place for them to all lay their head down. And I don't think they were real picky. I don't think his disciples at that point would have been like, well, I'm not sleeping unless you find us a 5-star hotel. They would have slept anywhere gladly and collapsed. But that's not what happened, is it? Here's what happens in the story next. Here's this word that Mark has. Immediately. See the word? Immediately. He made his disciples, right? Picture yourself, you're the disciples, you're worn out, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're heartbroken, you're grieved. You just, not only have you not been able to eat for the past few days because the crowds were so big, but now you have to be the ones serving the food to hungry people. It's kind of salt in the wounds, I think. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him. He didn't even get in the boat with them, and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. I don't know about you, but I'm going to pause here a second. You're the disciples. This all is happening. You know what's going on in my mind right now? Must be nice. Right? It must be nice to be able to go up, to have your quiet time, to go up on the mountain. You get to pray, you get to connect with God. You're having this moment with just you and God. And what are we doing? We're rowing. We're exhausted. We're tired. We're worn out. We're to the point of absolute collapse, physical collapse, because of exhaustion. Have you ever been there? Right? We've been there, to the point where, do you ever hallucinate? This ties into the story. Did you ever hallucinate before you were so tired? I have. I've had hallucinations. I've seen, I hate to admit this, but on one occasion I hallucinated very badly driving. This was back in our college days when we were invisible, and we would stay up, work all day, and then make the 14-hour drive at night after we ate dinner. Not the best idea. But that was how we rolled. So, Jeff Miller and I were both driving separately, and we were both getting really tired. And I remember, it just happened so quickly. And I saw this really bad accident in front of me, and it scared the living daylights out of me. And I was it was so real, and I saw it happen. And I blinked, and there was nothing there except empty road. And I was like, what in the world was that? It was a hallucination. It was a sleep-deprived induced hallucination. The disciples are there, and they're not sitting behind the wheel in the comfort of a seat. They're rowing. But the story gets worse. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. At about the fourth watch of the night, this is about 3 a.m, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. This is a really weird story, is it not? He meant to pass by them. Can you imagine? Let's just break this down for a minute, because it's so important to really get the depth of the story. They're all exhausted. They're wiped out. They're tired. They're angry. They're irritable. Jesus, instead of giving them rest, sends them out on the lake, and it's bad enough they had to row across the lake in the middle of the night after going, presumably, at least a couple days without sleep. Very little food because of the crowds pressing in against them. They're healing people. There's that emotional exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion, the grief from John the Baptist dying, which is in Mark. That's why they were getting across the lake in the first place to the other side. And now they're out rowing, and then the storm comes. And I think at this point, I think it's fair to say that they're livid. They're livid with Jesus. They're livid at the circumstance. They're livid at the storm. They're livid at all this stuff that's going on. And have you guys ever tried to row against the wind? Has anybody ever, any of you lake lovers, right? On our honeymoon, we went to Key West, Florida. I didn't know this because we were just, Natalie and I had dated for a year and a half before we got married. And so I didn't know that she had such a fear of water, because she faked it really well. But she's terrified of water. She hates water. She doesn't swim. Water that she can't see the bottom is especially scary to her. Swimming pools she can do, but water where she can't see the bottom, ponds, lakes, doesn't matter. If she can't see the bottom, she's terrified of it. I didn't know that. And I don't know if it was like we were still literally in the honeymoon phase. We were on our honeymoon. And she didn't want to tell me. She didn't want to be embarrassed. Whatever it was, I didn't know this. So we rent a canoe, and we go out. And there had just been a hurricane that came through a couple days before. And the wind was still hitting hard. And it was still choppy. And for me, I love water. And I'm like, whatever. No big deal. So we go out there. And, and this is in a little canoe, not a big, massive rowboat. And we're fighting this wind. And it's I'm in the back, she's in the front, and I'm just I am wiped out after about 15 minutes. And she's, cursing the waves and cursing me. And she's like, can we turn back around now? And I'm like, but honey, we got our rental. Let's enjoy these little choppy waves. We were getting battered out there, let's be honest. And I was like, we got to get our hour's worth at least. And she said, no, we got to turn around now. We got to get back. I'm scared. I don't like it. We're not going anywhere. And let's just turn around and let the wind push us into the shore and call it a day. And finally, I submitted because I was like, I can't fight. I can't fight this wind. It was literally 15 minutes. And I was exhausted. But I say all this because the fear of the water, I didn't know this until recent years, but Jewish people really didn't like being on the water. Under the water is where Leviathan is, right? That's where chaos is. In Jewish worldview, water represents chaos. Under the water represents darkness. It represents demons. When Jesus cast the demons into the pigs, where do they go? They go in the water, where they belong. There's this inherent idea that water, what's under the water, is really scary and dark and creepy and demonic and chaotic, and now the waters are churned. The waters are really angry, which means what? In their mind, likely, what are they thinking? Yeah, some kind of evil is lurking. Jesus, we need you. You ever feel scared, lonely, terrified of evil, dark things? Where do we turn? Where do atheists turn? We all turn to God, don't we? In those moments of sheer terror, everybody becomes a Christian. They're desperate for Jesus in this moment, and what does Jesus do? He shows up. He meant to pass them by. He's walking on water with ease, I assume. He's not rowing the boat. I can guarantee you that. And they see it, and it's as if he doesn't care, in their minds at least. This word is thello. Is that right? Thello? To will, to wish, to want something. It literally means something to the sense of he wanted to pass them by. This is translated, he meant to pass them by, but the real sense of that word is to will or to wish something to happen. He willed himself to pass them by. He meant to do it. It was intentional. It wasn't accidental. It's not like he was walking by and was like, oh, there they are. Like, he knew it, and he meant to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. What do you think's going on in their minds right now? Think about all the context of what we just talked about. What's going on in their minds? Yeah, why do they think he's a ghost? Ghosts walk on water? Maybe they think that. Maybe they think that they're seeing things too, right? Maybe they're so tired that it's like seeing a car accident that isn't there.
See, I would disagree with that, because it says they all saw him. The odds
True.
of all of the disciples seeing the same mirage.
Yeah, at the same time. Yep, good point. Good point.
I think what they're doing, as you all pointed out, they're exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
There's already been death. What
Yep.
happened to Jesus when he sent them? He's still with the crowd.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, what's the crowd going to do? Are they nervous about the crowd?
Yeah.
From where I'm sitting, back here, it looks more like they're thinking he's been killed.
That's a great point. That is really a good point. Which makes their fear level do what?
Oh, it's going through the ceiling.
It's at a level 50 out of 10.
Yeah, I mean, if you thought John the Baptist was bad,
Yeah.
your leader, you're thinking is now, the one you're directly tied to, you're thinking now is dead because here comes his ghost.
Yeah.
Which is a whole nother problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic point. John the Baptist, I mean, in the context, right? John the Baptist he wasn't protected. I mean, like that, he was killed. He was beheaded in a really grotesque manner. He was murdered. It was a homicide. Jesus is left alone with the crowd. Great point. The crowd is a little intense.
Well,
it's not.
If you read John's account, it says that he perceived that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king.
Yeah, there you go. So there must have been a conversation somewhere among them. You know, in order for that to be recorded in the scriptures, there must have been a conversation somewhere about this, because I don't think that John had the insight, Holy Spirit guided or not, to read Jesus' mind. Yeah. But there's this perception, yeah, great point, Brent, that he's going to be taken by force, and now they're left alone. Was he killed? That's a great, great point. And then they think it's his ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately, there's Mark's favorite word, immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." I always like this, because I'm like, again, I like to think about what the disciples were thinking. I think like they probably were cussing mad. I wonder if some of them were like, "Don't be afraid," you know, like mocking them back. Like, I don't know. This whole, such an intense story.
I don't think they're crying out to him.
Because they think he's dead.
I think they're terrified, and their crying out is more like yelling and screaming.
Yeah.
Pardon the use of this phrase, like a bunch of little girls.
Yeah.
They're terrified. I don't think they're mocking him when he gets in the boat.
Yeah. Maybe they were stuck in carpet or stuck in the bottom of the boat. Yeah, like, I don't know. It's such a bizarre story. And that's what we're going to unpack in the last 10 minutes, is why Jesus went this route. I mean, it's such a bizarre story. And it makes me anxious reading it. I read the story and I'm anxious for the disciples. And I don't want us to gloss over this story because, again, the topic is finding hope in the midst of a troubled world. You want to talk about a troubled world? Where's the hope? And Jesus says, don't be afraid. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. The wind stopped. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not, this is interesting, they did not understand about the loaves. Not the wind, not the storm, not the ghost, they didn't understand about the loaves. This is what's going on in their minds when all of this stops. They did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. All right, that's it. We're stopping with the scripture. We're going to unpack this a little bit. Let me start with what we do with exhaustion. In 2022 America, a friend, a family member, somebody we're close to is wiped out. How do you all respond? What do you do? What do you do about it?
It depends if it was 4 years ago or today.
Let's say today. You see somebody and they are physically shuffling across the floor. You can see they're wearing the exhaustion. Yeah, comfort them. What else? What are things that how do you personally respond? What do you do for your friend or family members?
Volunteer to help.
Volunteer to help.
Let them get some rest.
Get rest. Sometimes we order people to get rest. I'm not taking no for an answer. You need rest. Please go lay down. I will take care of everything. Listen to them. Comfort, listen. Send them to get rest. Tell them, order them to get rest. These are kind of the things that we do. Jesus, I don't want to say seemingly, because it's not seemingly. It's written in the scriptures. He does everything polar opposite. In their time of deepest exhaustion, sorrow, grief, despair, fear. Did I miss anything? What am I missing? Physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion, sorrow at the death, weariness from seeing all these needy people and not knowing how to take care of them, and then having to hand out the food. They're ready to collapse from that. On and on and on. They're on the water. They're scared. They're terrified. They're screaming out. They think they see a ghost. They now think Jesus is dead. A great point. And what in the world is on his mind? Why did he not just give them rest when he saw they needed it? It's where you guys get to teach. What lesson is in this? He sure did push them.
Pushing the boundaries of what they know they can do.
Yeah.
If you're trained in the military, mind you, I've never been in the military, so Elton can help us out here. But when you go to training camp, boot camp, I don't think they just work you until you just feel tired and need to rest.
Yeah.
They push you beyond what you know your limits are.
For what purpose?
To train you for those things that are going to be far worse in the future.
Yeah.
Though they're tired here, I don't see that that's being emphasized, or that they're upset. What's really being emphasized is that he's training their faith.
Yeah.
They didn't get the lesson of the loaves. They didn't get the lesson. He's training them to have faith. Is what he's doing.
Yeah. And why is faith important? I mean, because think about, Mark records these events back to back to back to back to back. I mean, it is like constant, like level 10 events, catastrophic events. Why is faith important? Why is that faith training important? Why Why the need to increase their faith? Yeah, because if you don't have faith, what do we see happen to people time and time again? You collapse. Or really bad, I don't know if it's worst case scenario, but it probably is, but you take your own life.
They've already exhausted themselves on the boat fighting the wind.
Yeah.
They're down mentally, they're down spiritually, they're down physically. So he decides to walk out towards them, but he meant to pass them.
Yeah.
But then when he does it, he turns towards them. He says, don't be afraid. But as soon as he gets to the boat, the wind ceases, and now the journey is calm. It's easier.
Yeah.
It's become easier.
Well, actually, I think in Matthew, which passage is it where they're immediately on shore? He calms.
So then in John's gospel account, they go to the other side, and there's now another crowd of thousands, and they're like, give us food,
But this won't be breakfast because they show up at the fourth watch at 6. So
Yeah, but it's, here's my takeaway from this in a nutshell. And again, I mean, we're not going to complete this thought even in the amount of time that we have left. So we'll spill into 2 weeks from now. Next week I'll be away. But I look at a radical divide almost with a chasm in between the way that we handle exhaustion and grief as Christians and the way that Jesus routinely handled it in the scriptures. I don't think this story is even that unique in the Bible. I look at all the times that they faced trouble and persecution and sorrow and being literally chased out of synagogues and out of towns and out of cities. And I mean, it was constant. It was constant. And I look at the way that we train our ministers. You have 2 of us here who went to be trained to be ministers, and it doesn't even compute with me anymore. That we were taught how to parse sentences, and I'm not making fun of my training at all. I think I am so grateful for the training that I got. But I had one class in 9 years of undergraduate and graduate school. I had one class on church conflict. It was an elective that I chose. It wasn't required. It was an elective that I chose to take on church conflict. Hands down, the most practical class that I probably took in all of my college and graduate career. Why is that not required? Why do we not talk about church conflict? Why are we not training our ministers to go through trouble?
Denial. There is no church conflict,
Yeah, well, and it's intentional denial. It's not even like accidental denial. It's this, and I experienced this in the realm of advocacy work, that these churches have these catastrophic events. They have a minister or an elder or some church leader who is not sinning, who's committing felony crimes. And the church covers it up like, nothing to see here. Like, don't you dare talk about it. God is good. We're going to build people up. We're going to inspire them. Like, right? We don't use the E word, exhaustion, in the church. We use the I word, inspire. Let's inspire and motivate people. I'm all for inspiring and motivating. I really am. Like, it needs to be done. But if we don't train people the way Jesus trained people, and I'm not recommending going this route exactly. I wouldn't even dream of attempting something this insanely crazy. But these exercises to build faith, instead of sprinkling Bible verses on people, and you guys know I talk about this all the time. It's one of my biggest pet peeves is when people are legitimately exhausted, spiritually drained, they're in the dumps, they've experienced some family tragedy. It's the drive-by Christians who sprinkle Bible verses on they're not the ones dealing with this stuff. And they like roll the window down as they're driving by, and they're throwing these little cards that they have Bible verses written on and be like, just increase your faith. And I'm like, no, yeah, that's not helpful. that doesn't help people to increase their faith. In fact, I think it probably has a very opposite effect. I think we need to acknowledge people's exhaustion. Instead of rushing to stop the exhaustion, let's start with acknowledging the exhaustion. Be like, why are you so tired? That goes to, somebody said, listening. We listen to people. Let's start with that before we rush into rescue, because we're not trained doctors, spiritual doctors. We're not trained spiritual nurses. Sometimes our job is just to listen to people and acknowledge the exhaustion. Jesus certainly didn't rush in and say, well, let's just take this all away. Let's go sleep. I'll drive the boat. You guys sleep. In fact, in another story, another account, what do we see Jesus doing in the boat? During one of these massive storms, what's he doing while his disciples are terrified? He's sleeping. Tex?
Question, Jenny. Now, this is my own personal thinking on this. How do we handle situations if we don't have experience in it? Whether it be medical,
Yeah.
whether it be you go to the hospital to visit somebody,
Yeah.
whether it be church conflict.
Yep, simple answer. Yep. One word comes to mind: delegation. Know your limits. It's what they did in Acts chapter 6. I mentioned that verse last Sunday. It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of preaching and teaching the word in order to wait on tables. That's not our gift. That's not our ability. That's not our desire. But it needs to be done. So, I think a lot of times we try to take on all these different roles, and we're like, well, I'm going to sit with them. I'm going to find a way to get their electric paid. I'm going to find a way to fill their tanks with oil so they have heat. I'm going to, and we get to the point where we're so exhausted. And what have we done to build their faith? In the end, not a whole lot. So, I think we need to take a step back and kind of look at this story and say, what is Jesus doing with them and why? Why does he not only tolerate exhaustion, he's like creating exhaustion. But then he comes in and he calms the storm and he rescues them. And then they kind of debrief. And that's what we'll talk about the next time. That period of debriefing and coming off of this period of exhaustion, because that's where you see hope well up. And you really do. And you see it with the disciples. I mean, I'm telling you, when you get to Acts chapter 2, you look at the disciples and you're like, wait, Pete, is this the same Peter who gets up? He's gets in front of this crowd and he's like, all right, ladies and gentlemen, let me talk to you about this Lord and Savior. And he just opens up Joel, starts reading from Joel. And you're like, is this the same? Is this the same Peter? Where did this come from? Well, training. It was rooted in his faith. All right, we got to take a hard break. Thank you guys, and we will see you in a few minutes.